In 1826, the British Empire authorized one of the most expensive military infrastructure projects in colonial history. Not a railway, not a fortress, a canal. 202 kilometers of hand-built locks carved through granite, swamp, and wilderness, connecting the Ottawa River to Lake Ontario. It was designed to stop an American invasion. Over 1,000 workers died building it. It cost 5 times the original budget, and the man who built it was recalled to England and never honored in his lifetime. Yet the canal was never used for its intended purpose. The Americans never invaded. The construction camp the man left behind? It became Ottawa, Canada's capital city. This is the Rideau Canal, the most important canal in Canada that no one talks about. To understand why this canal exists, you need to understand one corridor, the St. Lawrence River. It runs roughly 1,200 kilometers from Lake Ontario to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. In the early 1800s, it was Britain's only supply route between Montreal and the Great Lakes. Every soldier, every weapon, every barrel of gunpowder moving into Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario, traveled the St. Lawrence. And here's the problem. For roughly 280 kilometers between Montreal and Kingston, the St. Lawrence runs dangerously close to the American border. At Brockville, the border is less than 2 kilometers away. At Prescott, American territory is directly across the river. At some points, the river literally is the border. American cannons could reach British supply boats without leaving US soil. The War of 1812 proved this wasn't theoretical. American forces attacked British supply lines along this corridor. The Battle of Ogdensburg in 1813 happened right on the St. Lawrence. British convoys had to move under threat of interception for nearly 200 kilometers of exposed river. Britain held on. Barely. But the math was brutal. Upper Canada had roughly 150,000 people. The United States had over 9 million. A 60-to-1 population advantage. Britain could not defend a 280-kilometer exposed supply line against those numbers indefinitely. So Britain made a geographic calculation. If the St. Lawrence was vulnerable because of its proximity to the border, the solution was a second corridor, one that ran deeper into Canadian territory. The proposed route went north up the Ottawa River from Montreal, then cut southeast through the Rideau Waterway to Kingston on Lake Ontario. Total distance, roughly 400 kilometers. Longer than the St. Lawrence route by about 120 kilometers. But the critical difference wasn't distance. It was depth. The new route would run 100 to 200 kilometers from the American border at its closest point. That margin was the entire strategic logic. Britain wasn't building a canal, it was building a buffer, and the man they sent to build it was Colonel John By, a royal engineer, dispatched on orders from the Duke of Wellington. The Rideau Canal is not a single river, it's a chain. From Ottawa, the route follows the Rideau River south through a series of lakes: Dow's Lake, Long Island, Rideau Lake, Big Rideau Lake, Upper Rideau Lake, before crossing a height of land and descending through the Cataraqui River system into Kingston on Lake Ontario. The total elevation change is 133 meters. The canal climbs roughly 83 meters from the Ottawa River to the summit at Upper Rideau Lake, then descends about 50 meters to Lake Ontario. Every meter of that elevation had to be managed through hand-built locks, 47 of them, across 202 kilometers in 1826, with no machinery. Now consider the terrain. The northern section from Ottawa to Smiths Falls cuts through the Canadian Shield, Precambrian granite, some of the oldest rock on Earth, up to 1 billion years old. This isn't soft limestone. This is rock that resists everything. Workers blasted through it with black powder, meter by meter. The central section passes through the Frontenac axis, where the Canadian Shield crosses the St. Lawrence lowlands. Dense forest, swamp, and exposed bedrock. The southern section descending to Kingston runs through limestone and clay, prone to flooding and unstable ground. And then there were the swamps. The Cataraqui watershed in particular was thick, mosquito-infested marshland stretching for kilometers. Not small bogs, massive wetland systems that had to be drained or built through in an era before mechanized pumping. For scale, compare this to the Erie Canal in New York, completed 1 year earlier in 1825. The Erie was 584 kilometers long, nearly 3 times the Rideau's length. But it ran through the relatively flat Mohawk Valley with 172 meters of elevation change spread across that entire distance. The Rideau packed 133 meters of elevation change into 1/3 the length through shield granite and swamp. The Erie cost about $7 million. The Rideau would end up at 822,000 pounds, roughly $4 million, for a canal 1/3 the length. That cost ratio tells you everything about the terrain. The original budget approved by London was £169,000. Colonel By proposed a more ambitious design. Deeper channels with a minimum depth of 1.5 meters, locks measuring 40 meters long and 10 meters wide, large enough for military steamships. London approved the upgrade. The final bill came in at £822,000. Nearly 5 times the original estimate. In today's terms, roughly $100 million. That's close to half the British Ordnance Department's entire annual budget at the time, spent on one canal in the Canadian wilderness. The construction took 6 seasons. Hundreds of workers died, and some estimates put the toll at up to 1,000, mostly from malaria contracted in the swamp sections. They called it swamp fever. The worst outbreaks hit in 1827 and 1828, when construction was focused on the Cataraqui wetlands. Summers in eastern Ontario are humid, regularly hitting 30 degrees Celsius, creating perfect mosquito habitat in standing swamp water. There were no hospitals, no sanitation infrastructure. Workers either recovered or they didn't. Many of the dead were Irish immigrants whose deaths were never formally recorded, buried in unmarked graves along the canal route. But the engineering that came out of it was extraordinary. The Jones Falls Dam, 19 meters high, 107 meters wide, was the largest dam in North America at the time. Built from massive stone blocks in a valley so remote that every piece of material was hauled in by hand or by ox. It raised the water level by 18 meters to make the upper section navigable. The Ottawa Locks, a staircase of 8 locks dropping 24 meters from the canal to the Ottawa River in a single continuous flight. The Hogsback Dam, where the first structure collapsed during construction in 1829 and had to be completely rebuilt. 47 lock stations, 52 dams, over 30 kilometers of canal cuts blasted through rock. The canal opened in May 1832, fully operational. And then Colonel By was recalled to England to face a parliamentary inquiry over the cost overruns. He was never charged with corruption. There was no evidence of any, but his reputation was destroyed. He died in 1836 at 53, likely weakened by the malaria he contracted during construction. Never honored in his lifetime. The empire that sent him into the wilderness punished him for the cost of doing what they asked. But here's where the geography takes over. Because what the canal created was far more consequential than what it was designed to prevent. Colonel By built his construction camp at the northern entrance of the canal, right where the Rideau River meets the Ottawa River. He called it Bytown. It was a logistics base, nothing more. But look at where it sat, the confluence of 3 waterways, the Ottawa River, the Rideau River, and now the Rideau Canal. The Ottawa River alone is roughly 1,271 kilometers long, draining a watershed of about 146,000 square kilometers. That's larger than England. And in the 1800s, that watershed was one of the richest timber regions in North America. The Ottawa Valley was blanketed in white pine, the most valuable construction timber in the world at the time, in massive demand from the British Royal Navy and the construction industry. Bytown sat at the geographic pivot point. Timber could be floated down from the upper Ottawa Valley, processed at Bytown, and shipped south through the canal or east down the Ottawa to Montreal and then to Britain. The canal that was built for military logistics accidentally created a commercial logistics hub. By the 1840s, Bytown was a booming lumber town. By the 1850s, the Ottawa Valley timber trade was one of the largest in the world. In 1855, Bytown was incorporated as a city and renamed Ottawa. Population, roughly 10,000. Now here's the question that matters. How does a lumber town in the wilderness become the capital of a nation? In 1857, the province of Canada needed a capital. The candidates were Toronto, Montreal, Kingston, and Quebec City. Look at the geography of each. Toronto, roughly 100 kilometers from the American border at the nearest point, too exposed, and too far west to represent the whole country. Montreal, about 60 kilometers from the US border. It had just experienced violent political riots in 1849, where the Parliament building was literally burned down. Kingston, essentially on the American border, sitting directly on the St. Lawrence, the exact vulnerability that created the Rideau Canal in the first place. Quebec City, over 800 kilometers east of Toronto, too remote for English Canada, too French for political balance. Ottawa solved every problem. It sat on the border between Ontario and Quebec. The Ottawa River was literally the provincial boundary. English on one side, French on the other. Symbolic compromise. It was roughly 150 kilometers from the American border, farther than every other candidate. It had the Rideau Canal connecting it to Kingston and the Great Lakes. It had the Ottawa River connecting it to Montreal and the St. Lawrence. Two transportation corridors feeding a single city. Queen Victoria chose Ottawa. A construction camp became a capital because the infrastructure built around it, for a completely different purpose, made it seem like the only rational choice. That's unusual. Most national capitals are deliberate. Washington, D.C. was purpose-built on the Potomac, chosen as a geographic compromise between northern and southern states. Brasilia was constructed from nothing in the 1950s, placed in the interior to shift Brazil's center of gravity away from the coast. Canberra was built specifically to resolve the rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne, placed almost exactly between them. Ankara was chosen by Ataturk to replace Istanbul, moving Turkey's political center into the Anatolian heartland. These were strategic decisions. Governments looked at a map, identified the optimal location, and built. Ottawa wasn't that. Ottawa was a side effect. A construction camp that grew because of river geography and timber economics, then became a capital because every other option had a worse relationship with the American border. And the canal that created it? Compare it to what other canals became. The Panama Canal, 82 kilometers, 3 lock sets, roughly 14,000 ships per year, over $4 billion in annual revenue. The Suez Canal, 193 kilometers, no locks, roughly 20,000 ships per year. The Welland Canal in Ontario, 43 kilometers, 8 locks, about 36 million tons of cargo annually. The Rideau Canal, 202 kilometers, 47 locks, commercial cargo traffic essentially zero. It moves more kayaks than container ships. By every conventional measure of canal success, trade volume, strategic utility, economic output, the Rideau is a failure. And yet it might be the most consequential canal in Canadian history, not because of what it carried, but because of what it accidentally created. A capital city, a metropolitan area that now holds over 1 million people and produces roughly $50 billion in GDP annually. The St. Lawrence Seaway, opened in 1959, handles 35 to 40 million tons of cargo per year. Canada spent billions building it. The Trans-Canada Highway stretches over 7,800 kilometers. The Canadian Pacific Railway stitched the country together coast to coast. Those were deliberate national-scale infrastructure decisions made by Canada. The Rideau Canal, the project that created the capital, was built by the British Empire out of fear, not by Canada out of vision. Canada's most important canal wasn't a Canadian decision. It was a British panic response that happened to reshape a nation. And here's the part that makes this story even stranger. The canal is still there. All 47 original lock stations still exist. Many still operate manually, the same way they did in 1832. Parks Canada staff still crank the locks open by hand. The engineering that Colonel Bai built nearly 200 years ago is still functional. In 2007, the Rideau Canal was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the best preserved examples of a 19th century slackwater canal in the world. Every winter, the 7.8-kilometer stretch through downtown Ottawa becomes the Rideau Canal Skateway, often cited as the world's largest naturally frozen skating rink. Millions of people skate on the same waterway that was engineered to move British warships away from American guns. Colonel Bai got his recognition, about 150 years too late. There's a statue of him at Majors Hill Park in Ottawa overlooking the locks he built. The Bytown Museum sits in the oldest stone building in Ottawa, the commissariat building he constructed during the canal project. The city named after his construction camp is now the political heart of Canada, home to Parliament, the Supreme Court, the headquarters of the federal government. Canada's capital exists because of a canal, 202 kilometers through Canadian Shield granite and swamp, authorized by a foreign empire to defend against an invasion that never came. The engineer who built it died, thinking he was a failure. But the construction camp at the northern end sat at the confluence of three waterways in the middle of the richest timber region in North America, 150 kilometers from the American border. It grew into a city, and when Canada needed a capital, Ottawa was the only option that solved every geographic and political problem on the table because of infrastructure that was never built for Canada in the first place. So the real question isn't whether Canada's capital was planned. It's whether the most important geographic decisions in a country's history are ever really decisions at all, or whether they're accidents that just happen to sit at the right confluence.